Philadelphia, the summer of 1776. The men gathered at the Pennsylvania State House, the building we now call Independence Hall, had been poring over a document and arguing about it for weeks. They argued about the language, the timing, about whether this was the right moment to put pen to paper, about whether there ever could be such a moment. After all, ink on the page was almost certainly going to lead to blood on the streets. The Declaration of Independence was adopted by the Continental Congress on July 4, 1776, although many delegates didn't actually sign it until August 2nd, a fact that tends to get lost in the mythology of the American story. But the date on the document is July 4th, and that's the date that stuck. America's birthday since and forever after. The signers of the Declaration had at least some idea what they were getting themselves into. They knew they were committing an act of high treason against the crown, punishable by torture and death. Mostly, the signers were men of means, men with plenty and everything to lose. They signed the paper anyway. You know what happened next: the war, Valley Forge, Washington crossing the Delaware in the still of night, Yorktown, Cornwallis, the Treaty of Paris, a constitution, a republic, 100,000 histories and communities in places across the United States, all finding some bit of their own origin more than 2 centuries ago in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The men who were there in the beginning, either at the signing or on revolutionary battlefields or in the seats of America's earliest federal government, those men would become historical figures. They'd become heroes and then myths and then legends. They would receive monuments on the National Mall, cities and counties and universities bearing their names. You've seen them represented time and again in school pageants, on portraits and paintings, in movies and textbooks, and even in a hip-hop musical that somehow became a cultural phenomenon. 250 years after they launched a revolution, the founders are still here. They've been carved into marble and mountains. They're in your wallet. They have their own national holidays, and some of them have a street named after them in South Bend, Indiana. Hello and welcome to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Helman, and during this series, we're going for a drive around South Bend to tell the important, zany, strange, and unexpected tales behind just a few of its street names. During the course of this episode, you'll hear fictional advertisements for very real historical companies and products. We do that to help break up the podcast, provide some levity, to include just a little more history than we could otherwise, and to give you a sense of the time and place when and where all of this is happening. The absence of actual paid advertisements is made possible by the generous underwriting of all 8 episodes in the series by the Doug Hunt family. In this episode, we're remembering the American Revolution and visiting a few of the more under-the-radar figures who played important roles during America's founding period. Of course, you already know that South Bend has a Washington Street and a Jefferson Street. We've got an Adams Road. We've got a Madison Street and a Monroe Street, too. You already know who those guys are. Today, we're finding a few more early revolutionaries, guys who are a little less famous and sometimes a little more complicated. We're going to start on Wayne Street, which cuts through the heart of downtown South Bend right past the public library. And the man it's named for is one of the most fascinating and troubling figures of the entire founding era. His name was Anthony Wayne, and he was one of the very first soldiers of the American Revolution. When the Continental Congress was gathering in Philadelphia in the summer of 1776, debating the language of the Declaration and weighing the consequences of signing it, Anthony Wayne wasn't in that room. He wasn't carrying a pen, but he already had a gun. He'd been commissioned as a colonel in the Continental Army in January of that year, 6 months before the Declaration was adopted, and he spent the Revolution doing what he did better than almost anything else: fighting. He earned the nickname Mad Anthony early on, and he earned it honestly. He'd been thrown off a Pennsylvania political committee for being, in their words, a warlike radical. He denied the allegation, but the nickname stuck anyway. When the war broke out, there were plenty ready to call the founders warlike radicals themselves. Mad Anthony Wayne was going to fit right in. He fought the British across North America, winning some battles and losing more than he probably should have. He took a bullet to the leg that was never removed. He overcame a mutiny by his own troops. At the Battle of Green Spring, Wayne's forces found themselves stuck in a trap, but Wayne ordered his men on an unexpected and possibly insane bayonet charge directly through the enemy lines. It was exactly the kind of decision that would get you killed or get you a promotion. It got him a promotion. The war ended, and that's where things got complicated for Anthony Wayne because it turned out he wasn't much good when he wasn't fighting. He failed as a tanner. He failed as a Georgia plantation owner. A congressional scandal ended his political career before it even really began. By 1792, Wayne was bankrupt, estranged from his wife, and running out of options. So he did what he always did. He went looking for war. As it happened, the United States did have one available. The Northwest Indian War, a conflict over the territory that would eventually become Indiana, had been going badly for the Americans. Very badly. The Miami war chief Little Turtle had crushed 2 American armies in succession. The United States needed someone to turn things around, and Wayne lobbied his old friend George Washington until Washington gave him the job. It worked. Wayne rebuilt the army, established a string of military outposts, and wore down the Native American Confederation until Little Turtle finally agreed to negotiate. He called Wayne the chief who never sleeps. It was a compliment of the highest order. The war ended with the Treaty of Greenville in 1795. Wayne got his peace, and the United States got millions of acres of land. The Native American tribes got a promise that Indiana would remain Indian territory forever. It was not a promise that was kept. History doesn't know if Wayne meant the promise when he made it. What history does record is that Indiana became a state 15 years later, and the Native Americans were gone within another 30. Mad Anthony Wayne is a complicated revolutionary figure, and he certainly isn't one that most people would claim as a personal hero. He was, among other things, a slaveholder, a philanderer, and a man whose unchecked temper got people killed, including at least 30 Native American prisoners he had executed in a moment of uncontrolled rage. That's probably why he's forgotten, just a little bit, across most of the historical canon, but not in South Bend, Indiana, where Wayne Street cuts an east-west line right through downtown the same way it has for almost 200 years.
The Fulton Market is ringing in the 1898 New Year with a long-awaited move to 323 South Michigan Street. South Bend's #1 fish market is selling salt fish for a penny, fresh fish for just 3 cents a pound, and oysters for 20 cents a quart. No one can beat that deal, so come on down to Fulton's. And now back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
Lafayette Street runs north and south through South Bend, and that means it intersects with Wayne Street, which turns out to be historically appropriate. The two men knew each other. They fought together. They helped win a war and build a nation. Lafayette's full name was Marie Joseph Paul Yves Roche Gilbert du Motier, Marquis du Lafayette, which is a name that was always going to have to get shortened if it was going to make it onto a street sign. He was French. He was wealthy, he was an aristocrat, and in 1777 he was 19 years old when he decided to leave all of that behind and sail to America to fight in someone else's revolution. The French government, not wanting to antagonize the British, had issued a direct order forbidding him from going. Lafayette defied that order. He purchased a vessel, named it La Victoire, and sailed across the Atlantic to join a war that had nothing to do with him, except that Lafayette believed that the American cause was the cause of liberty itself. Lafayette arrived in South Carolina in June 1777 and made his way north to Philadelphia, where he introduced himself to George Washington. Washington, who had no sons of his own, and Lafayette, who had lost his own father young, took to each other almost immediately. The childless general and the orphaned aristocrat. Washington gave him a command. Lafayette proved worthy, and then some. He was wounded at the Battle of Brandywine. He spent that winter at Valley Forge. He outmaneuvered the British at the Battle of Barren Hill, leading a force that was badly outnumbered and getting everyone out alive through a combination of quick thinking and sheer audacity. By the time Yorktown came in 1781, Lafayette had helped set the trap that ended the war, maneuvering Cornwallis into position while Washington moved in for the final blow. He was 23 years old. After the war, Lafayette returned to France, where there was the matter of a revolution in that nation to deal with and struggle through. Meanwhile, on the other side of the ocean, the United States was growing and evolving. It would be decades before Lafayette ever returned stateside, and he must have been amazed at what he saw when, in 1824, President James Monroe invited Lafayette back to the United States for a farewell tour. Lafayette was 66 by then, and he was the last surviving Major General of the Continental Army. The country received him like a returning hero, which is exactly what he was. He met every living former president. He became the first foreign dignitary ever to address a joint session of Congress. Crowds lined the streets everywhere he went. Across 13 months, he visited all of the states, now up to 24 from the original 13. His visit to Indiana was the briefest of those, although it was far from the least exciting. It was on the Ohio River, near the Indiana border, where Lafayette's steamboat sank into angry waters. He made it as far as Jeffersonville, at the very southern tip of the state, before turning back. But here's the thing about that tour. It generated an enormous wave of goodwill, and an enormous wave of honorary names for the French aristocrat turned American revolutionary. Streets and cities and counties all over the country took his name in the years that followed, and that wave landed in Indiana at exactly the right moment. Indiana had only become a state in 1816. The state was still being built, still being named, still figuring out what it wanted to call its roads and its towns. Lafayette's nationwide tour generated nationwide headlines at the precise moment when Indiana was looking to name lots of its cities and streets. That's how a French aristocrat who spent about 48 hours in Indiana gets a street in South Bend. He never made it to South Bend, and he never got particularly close, but one of his artifacts from that tour, an important one, did. During his farewell tour, Lafayette traveled in a stylish, ceremonial carriage built just for the occasion. One of those carriages survived, and it eventually made its way into the collection of a South Bend company you may have heard of, Studebaker. It's been in the Studebaker National Museum's permanent collection ever since. So, if you want to see a vehicle that actually carried Lafayette through the United States, you don't have to go far. It's a heck of a lot easier than diving for a steamship on the Ohio River. You might know Lafayette's name from 100 street signs, or from the hip-hop musical that gave him a whole new generation of admirers. But he earned his name recognition the old-fashioned way first, by crossing an ocean as a teenager, at his own expense, against his government's orders, to fight for an idea he believed in. And that's probably worth the street.
Orlando Hurd knows that sometimes people on one side of the river need to get to the other side of the river. Well, how would you do that, you might wonder? Can you fly? No, you cannot fly. But you can take a ferry boat, recently established by Mr. Hurd in Mishawaka. The ferry boat, for when you're on one side of the river, but you really need to be on the other. And now back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
Our last stop in this episode is Kosciuszcko Street on South Bend's near west side. And if you've made it this far into an episode about under-the-radar revolutionary figures, you're about to meet the most under-the-radar of all of them, which is genuinely unfortunate, because his story might be the most remarkable one. His name was Thaddeus Kosciuszko. He was Polish, but you probably already figured that out from the name. Kosciuszko was a trained military engineer, and in 1776 he got on a boat and sailed to America because he believed in the Revolution, which puts him in exactly the same category as Lafayette, a foreigner who showed up, uninvited, to fight for an idea. What he found was an army in desperate need of a man with his talents. Benjamin Franklin noticed the need as well. He got Kosciuszko the job, and it was a good call made none too soon. What Kosciuszko brought to the Continental Army was something it desperately needed and didn't know how to ask for. The ability to look at a piece of landscape and understand immediately how to use it as a weapon, where to build fortifications, where to position artillery, where to force the enemy to fight on your terms instead of theirs. His most important contribution came at Saratoga in 1777. Kosciuszko surveyed the terrain and selected the ground where the Continental Army would make its stand, a ridge called Bemis Heights that gave the Americans a commanding position over the British advance. If you don't follow all of that, it's fine. What you need to know is that many historians consider the Battle of Saratoga to be the turning point of the entire war, and that Thaddeus Kosciuszko was the biggest part of the reason the Americans won it. That's not me talking. Revolutionary General Horatio Gates said it himself, and George Washington praised Kosciuszko repeatedly in his letters, although it bears mentioning, he almost never spelled the man's name right. The British defeat there convinced France to enter the conflict on the American side, and it's hard to imagine that the revolution would have succeeded without the support of the French. After the revolution, Kosciuszko returned to Poland, where he led an uprising against Russian and Prussian occupation, a rebellion that failed, that left him wounded and imprisoned, and that made him a national hero to the Polish people. He came back to America for a visit in 1797, was received as a hero, and eventually settled in Europe, where he died in 1817. He left a will in the States, and the will is worth mentioning because it says something about the man that none of the battles quite capture. Kosciuszko left his entire American estate to be used to purchase enslaved people their freedom and to provide them with education, land, and tools to build a life. He named Thomas Jefferson as the executor of the will, and Jefferson, who had once called Kosciuszko the purest son of liberty he had ever known, declined to carry out the wishes of the will. It was eventually invalidated by the Supreme Court in 1852. Kosciuszko deserved better from Jefferson. He probably deserved better from history too, which has not been nearly as generous to him as it was to the men who signed the Declaration and got their faces on the money. He deserves to be remembered with a musical all his own, and someone someday will have a ton of fun writing rhymes with his wonderfully lyrical name. Until then, at least South Bend remembers Thaddeus Kosciuszko. Kosciuszko Street runs through the middle of what were once several Polish neighborhoods. The Polish immigrants who settled in South Bend brought their own history with them, and part of that history was Thaddeus Kosciuszko, a Polish-American hero with roots in an old country, and a legacy worth remembering in a new one. Hey, thanks for joining us on A Bend in Time presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org. I'm your host, Aaron Helman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. Thanks again to the Doug Hunt family for underwriting this episode and all 8 episodes in the series. I have had a ton of fun remembering some of South Bend's historic street names, and I'm looking forward to our next series where we'll dive into South Bend 1831, the year when South Bend took its first census and really began to become a place. I hope you'll tune in for that one next. Until then, keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.